All right, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rich, airing from my bedroom. Isn't that cool? All right, so we have a very special guest on tonight. I'm very, very excited about this. We have B. Sidney Smith, or otherwise known as Sid Smith. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited too.
Good, good, good. So we have much to discuss and some really, really interesting things. I just, in doing research for guests on or just topics on this for this show, I stumbled across some really interesting people. And recently, you are the one that I stumbled upon, watching your video about the mathematics and science of collapse, and we'll get to that in a bit.
Mhm.
However, Sid is a resident of Virginia, and he is a member of the Green Party out there. And so, why don't we start with you talking about your participation in the Green Party, how you got there, why you got there, and what's going on?
Sure. I became a Green Party supporter in 2012, um, and was because I was very excited about the Stein-Hunkela campaign in 2012, and donated to it and followed it, and so on and so forth. I wasn't yet a member of the party, but I was very much aware of it, and very much felt myself a supporter. And then when the election was over, I thought, well, okay, so I should probably try to get involved in some way. And I sought out my state party, Virginia Green Party, and started to go to meetings and got involved, and eventually became an officer. And by 2016, I was a co-chair of the Green Party of Virginia, and that was very exciting with the 2016 election campaign. We had Jill out here a couple of times and hosted her, and I introduced her. That was all very, very nice. um, and I started to go to national meetings. I went to the nominating convention in 2016 in Houston, and then subsequent meetings nationally. Got on the national committee, started to do committee work. Just sort of became more and more and more active, and really enjoying it. Um, and that continued, I would say, up until about 2019. And then I had some personal issues, things in my own life that required my much greater attention, and my bandwidth began to narrow quite significantly. And so by 2021, I had simply reached the point where I didn't have the bandwidth to be able to give much. So I'm still active in my state party. I'm still the general secretary of the Green Party of Virginia. But I'm slowly moving away. I've given a number of years. I've reached a certain age, and I have certain responsibilities where now I think I need to pass that baton on. But I'm still a firm believer in the principles of the Green Party. I think it's the only sensible political party in the country, um, and I certainly hope it starts to be more successful.
All right, well, very well said. That's great, and thank you for all you've done for the Green Party. And we understand, or I understand, that things happen, and sometimes you got to move on. And principles you can keep you can carry principles around all the time because they're abstractions.
Sure.
So you know,
Well, it's very fun to belong to the only political party in the country that has principles. So,
I I noticed that too because I was actually a libertarian before
mm,
I turned to the Green Party because
mhm,
libertarians, if you line up 10 libertarians and ask them one question, you're going to get nine different answers.
mhm, mhm.
And they didn't seem to have anything going on when it came to the environment, which was always been a big issue for me since I was a kid. I've always not understood how people thought it was okay to back then it
Right.
was more about pollution than it was climate change or anything
Mhm,
else. Just
mhm,
like why would you pollute water in the air? It's stupid.
mhm.
So but yeah, no. Once I found the Green Party, after becoming discontent with the Libertarian Party, which I was in the Libertarian Party for like 8 months or something, and
Mhm,
um,
mhm,
I was like, I know I was very impressed that they actually had formalized principles 1 through 10. Here we
mhm,
go, and then
mhm,
they expand
mhm.
on each of those.
Right.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So okay, well, very cool. So let's talk about your YouTube video that I found. And well, you also mentioned earlier before we started airing that you are coming up with a new video. It's half finished. Want to start with that?
Right. Well, so let me sort of unpack how this all started. The thing that actually led me to the Green Party initially, that I
Mhm.
sort of discovered it, was I was becoming more and more interested in the trajectory of our own civilization. Um, our civilization has been collapsing. By our civilization, I mean industrial civilization.
Okay.
Industrial civilization has been in collapse mode for about 50 years now, starting around the 1970s, early 70s. And as that became more and more clear to me, I started to study it more and more deeply, and that's one of the things that led me to the Green Party. It was like, what are we going to do here? We need, we need to take some political action, and obviously it can't be based on what's best for GM. So
Right.
that sort of pushed me toward the Green Party. But I've been studying the trajectory of industrial civilization and for 20 years, and writing about it and speaking on it for many years. Um, the first talk that I gave was at Virginia Tech in 2018. Um, and I titled it "Humanity: The Final Chapter," and I really focused on our impact on the environment. There was some impact. There was some focus on social issues and our social decline, which is very important. But in that talk, I really focused on the environment. Um, and then in 2019, they invited me back to give another talk, which was kind of cool. I wasn't expecting that, and so I took really a couple of months to sit down and really study hard. And what I came up with was, for the first time for myself, really a synthesis of all the things that have to do with the collapse of industrial civilization, and starting to make sense of all the things that are happening now, um, which have been coming for a long time, but are actually starting to unfold in real time. Um, and so that talk I titled "How to Enjoy the End of the World," because one of the points that I made in it, one of the central points, was that collapse is not only underway, but it's inevitable, it's unstoppable. And what we have to think about is not how to stop it, since that's not going to happen, but rather how to live with it and how to look toward the future and how to start laying the seeds of what comes next. So that was where that whole "How to Enjoy the End of the World" thing came from. That video went viral, which the other one had not done. And within a year, I had 100,000 views and a couple thousand followers, and people emailing me every day with questions and criticisms and other things, and begging for another talk, which COVID made impossible. There were scheduled more talks, but COVID made it impossible to go back to VT. So I decided to start learning how to make my own videos, and I did spend a lot of time on that last year. And so there's now a new series of videos. The series is called "How to Enjoy the End of the World." And if you YouTube it, you Google it in my name, it'll come right up. And so that's what I'm working on currently. There are 4 videos I've made. There's another one that's in production now. The current one is called "Why Civilizations Die." And I really delve into exactly what the mechanisms are that cause civilizations to die, why they die, what is it that's unique about them that makes them do this. Um, and yeah, that's kind of how that all happened. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I turned my mic off.
That's fine.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, no, I have a certain fascination with collapse as well, and just the intellectual part of me just wants to know the logistics of it.
Hmm.
You know, the moral part of me wants to know like how I deal with it. Um, so I certainly seemingly haven't done as much research as you have on it. So why don't you go ahead and tell us as well as you can, as rationally, because I know there's like mathematics and physics involved here. Um,
Sure. Well, I'll try not to make it sound like a college lecture.
okay.
Let me see if I can let me see if I can sort of just lay the draw the big picture, so to speak. Um, so our civilization, industrial civilization, is only a couple of hundred years old, and that's one of the first things to realize, because most civilizations last, quite a few centuries as a rule. I mean, there's a lot of variability. Some of them burn out quickly. Some of them will go on for 1,000 years. Some of them will go on for 500 or 600 years and then sort of collapse and then just sort of gestate for a bit and then reflower. I mean, China has done that over and over. Just as an example, Egypt did it a couple of times. There was the old kingdom, the middle kingdom, and the new kingdom, and in between things sort of turned to chaos, but then they recovered. Um, there are really there are 3 features of civilization that we have to know about in order to understand why they collapse. First of all, we have a capacity for abstract language.
Yes.
And on this planet, so far as we know, we're the only species that has that capacity. And what it allows us to do is to create abstract social rules. Now, there are lots of social animals, and they have social roles, right? So there's, the alpha dog in a pack, so to speak, the rooster in a flock, and so on and so forth. So having social roles isn't something that's unique to us by any means, but most of those social roles are all concrete, right? So the social role of parent, or tribe member or leader depend upon the person who occupies that role. Once the person's gone, the role is gone. But we create abstract social roles like prime minister, right? And that prime minister is an abstract social role that is independent of whoever happens to be occupying it.
Right.
And our capacity to do that allows us to create a layer of complexity on top of our so to speak, native social nature, that can grow. And it grows in accordance with our capacity to solve problems. And this is the second essential feature of civilization. Civilizations are problem-solving machines. They came into being, before the show, we talked a little bit about the deep green resistance people and their concern about agriculture. And they're not wrong in this sense that agriculture was where civilization began. Agriculture was the solution to a problem. If you're a hunter-gatherer, it's really great as long as there's game and food. You don't have to work too much. There's no bosses, plenty of time for song. But if the food gets scarce, if there's a couple of really bad years, right, and if the game fluctuates too wildly, then you've got a real problem. People starve to death. Agriculture solved that problem. Agriculture made it so you didn't have to worry about how food fluctuated, because you could grow grain, you could store it in silos. You could maintain your flock, feed them from the silos, and you always had meat, and so on and so forth. It was the solution to a problem. Created all of its own problems, right? Like, how to be successful at agriculture. That's a complicated business. How to take care of your animals, how to keep them from being eaten by predators, and so on. And so this problem-solving dynamic builds and builds and builds and builds, and our capacity to create abstract social roles gives us a very powerful tool for solving those problems. The downside of all that is that most problems are caused by solutions, right? So like the hunter-gatherer didn't worry about the predators eating his prey animals unless they ate too many, but if you're the herder, you're very much worried about keeping the wolf away from the sheep. That's a problem that was created by the solution. Every solution brings with it its own set of problems. Most problems are caused by solutions. So those are the first two things. We have the capacity to create all these abstract social roles, and we are a problem-solving system. That's what civilizations do. The third thing, and this is where all the physics and stuff comes in, civilizations are dissipative structures. And I talk about this a lot in that in the new series particularly, but I also did in that second, the original How to Enjoy the End of the World video. A dissipative structure is a structure that grows in complexity and size according to the amount of energy flowing through it. And the energy dynamically structures it, so that's what makes it a dissipative structure. And like all dissipative structures, it relies on that external source of energy. That energy has to keep flowing, and in fact, it has to flow in increasing amounts, and I can unpack why that is, but I just want to give the broad overview. And so we have a highly abstract system with all these artificial roles that people occupy, like member of the National Committee, for example. And we have this problem-solving dynamic, and we need energy to be constantly flowing through the system in order for it all to work. Those are the three essential characteristics of a civilization. You've got to have each one, and they have to work together, or there is no civilization. But if you have those three things, then you've got a civilization going. Why do civilizations die? Well, it has to do with each of these three essential features. Let's talk about the dissipative structure aspect first, because that's kind of the most obvious. You have to have that reliable source of energy to maintain the system, to keep it going. If you get more energy than you need, then you grow. But when you grow, you increase the day-to-day cost of maintenance, right? Because it costs just to stay alive. You have to eat just to keep your body going, in addition to getting the calories you need to go hunt more. You have to, once you've built a new road, you have to repave it occasionally. Once you've created a new social role, you have to institutionalize it and pay salaries and so on and so forth. So anytime the structure grows, usually in response to new solutions to old problems, it increases the cost of running the structure. And that never stops, because the situation is never static. It just keeps going. And, as we know, you can't grow forever in a finite space, and the Earth is a finite space. So even if we could somehow magically continue to get all the energy we needed to run it, eventually we'd just get too big. For one thing, we'd drown in our own waste.
Ugh.
But the reality is that we know that we can't keep getting more and more energy. In fact, global energy production peaked in late 2018 and is now headed inexorably down.
Oh,
That's one of the primary drivers of the current war in Europe, and is one of the primary drivers of the upcoming great financial crisis, which people more and more are starting to talk about being just around the corner. You never know about these things. One of my favorite examples when talking about these things is it's always like playing Jenga, right? You know the tower is going to fall, but until it does, you don't know exactly when, and you don't know exactly in which direction. That's how these things go. So we have uncertainty. We know things are going to fall, but we don't know exactly how or when or why. And anyone who says they do know, they're kidding you.
okay.
So then that's the dissipative structure problem. It's part and parcel with the problem solving issue, because problem solving suffers from what's called diminishing returns. When you solve initial problems, early on in a system, it really increases its efficiency. It makes it possible for it to grow more. It gets a better energy return on its investment in energy to run it. But as things go along, the benefit from each new solution to the newly existing problems is more and more marginal. It becomes less and less. And there's a famous book by an anthropologist named Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Civilizations, in which he unpacks this process in great detail, using many historical examples. I recommend it if this is something that really interests you. So we have the dissipative structure problem of running short of energy. We have the problem-solving situation where we're constantly creating new problems, but the solutions we come up with are less and less effective at solving those problems. And eventually we reach a point where we face usually existential predicaments that we have no solution to. And that leads to the third issue, and that is our abstract institutions. Because those institutions are abstract, they kind of exist on faith. A dollar has value because everyone agrees that it does. Otherwise, it's just no more than a piece of toilet paper.
Right.
A prime minister is prime minister because people say she is and act accordingly. If they stop doing that, it doesn't matter what she calls herself. There's no longer this office of prime minister. What happens when a society or a civilization reaches the point where it can no longer solve its predicaments, and it no longer has the energy for maintenance and begins to fall apart? Then people lose faith in those institutions. The very language that built them is called into question. People start speaking past one another, speaking a different language, using the same words but with different meanings. Take, for example, the different ways that freedom is used by conceptually by different political groups. Then you think about the political polarization that's taking place all around the world, United States, Europe. The language and the faith that goes with it that holds those institutions together begins to fracture. And at a certain point, the society no longer will sustain its institutional integrity. And when that happens, then you get a very rapid complexity collapse of the very structure of the civilization itself, because the institutions fail, the institutions collapse. We've seen that, of course, many times historically. It often happens in different places regionally, but it can also happen to a whole civilization all at once. And when it occurs, we give it big names like the fall of Rome, right? But that's the pipeline we're looking down now, and it really helps to explain a lot of the things that are going on now. So that's the shortest answer I know how to give.
Brief but profound for sure. And all of that makes a lot of sense to me. Having like a paper away from a master's degree in system science, you're just basically describing like everything I learned. Not everything, but most of what I learned. I mean, one of the adages, if you will, or sayings in system science is all current problems are caused by solutions to previous problems. Which is you're like, oh my god, that's true, and it's kind of just it gives you this sense of dread and futility. But
and that sets up the horrible dynamic of reaching a point where you've got all these problems you've created and you can't find any solutions, and then you're up against the wall.
Exactly. And the more complex, another one too was concerning complex systems. Sufficiently complex systems tend to be tend to run more efficiently when decentralized, and there's all sorts of tendencies in there. And what's happening now is because we're trying to solve so many global problems, we keep centralizing the commanding problem solvers, and I don't know how that's going to work out so well. So that's, I mean, that's not something that you address, but I mean, there is, I mean, complexity, you know, the KISS, keep it simple, stupid, is really a profound thing for people, a very wise
Mhm.
thing for people to adhere to. Let the mind be complex, let physical reality around you be simple.
Yeah.
Okay, that's how I live my life. I'm very much a minimalist. I can put every physical thing I own in the back of my truck, but I keep my mind as active and as possible.
Mhm.
I think that's just a better way to be personally. But okay,
Yeah.
that's very interesting. So how what's you see? You mentioned something like a certain amount of followers and subscribers on your YouTube thing.
Mhm.
How long have you been doing the videos for? And like what you
Well, as
mentioned?
I say, the
Go ahead.
first talk, which was videotaped and we put up online, was in 2018,
Okay.
and then again in 2019. And then I've done several interviews, because once those videos became popular, there's what's called a doomer community, right? People who are ready for the end to come.
Right.
And so I did some interviews with different people. There's a really nice fellow named by the name of Michael Dowd. He's a minister, and he really talks a lot about how to deal with the fact of collapse, from a human point of view, and from the point of view of, okay, here I am in this situation. How do I deal with this on a personal level? Um, and so that was very nice. But there are a lot of folks, and so I did some interviews, and then, as I say, I'm creating these new videos, because there's so many people have asked so many questions, and it's clear that a lot of this stuff needs to get unpacked, especially in the present moment, because 2022 has turned out to be one of the watershed years in the way collapse is unfolding in this civilization. So, in the present moment, people are really looking for a handle, right, on the moment to see if they can wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, I think also like just the pandemic kind of just really took a toll on a lot of
It
people's
did. It did. It also masked a lot of the stuff that was going on at the time. Many people aren't aware that in late 2019 we hit a mini great financial crisis. The Fed was tapering off of quantitative easing, trying to shut off the tap, so to speak, for all that easy money for the financial system. And in 2019, they had a very near miss with another threat of the kind of thing that happened at the end of 2007, where all of a sudden the financial system just freezes and everything breaks. And if you go back and look at the money supply, you'll see that in October 2019, they injected a huge amount of liquidity into the financial system to prevent that from happening. But things were teetering like mad. And then COVID hit and everything shut down. So the fact that we nearly
Ooh,
had another great financial crisis, the fact that we'd already hit peak energy production globally in late 2018, all of those things got obscured by the crisis of COVID. But now that COVID has ceased to be quite the crisis that it was, um, people are inclined to think that all these current problems are a consequence of COVID, and they're not. They were already happening, and it's the fact that we're coming out of those lockdowns and the economy is trying to restart that is throwing up all of these new crises.
yeah, no, that's extremely interesting. And you're right. I don't think a lot of people realize that. Think like you have new presidents get into office, and like they take claim for and the economy on an upsurge or something. And people don't realize the complexity of economic systems, and they don't turn on a dime like that. I guess there can be specific tragedies and downturns that can happen very quickly, but. Yeah, no, I mean these complex systems. I mean, you have the seeds of what's happening now from like back in the day, and they tend to grow over time. Can you Sorry, did you want to say something? Go.
I was just going to say, with respect to the economy in particular, I wrote an essay in 2019, which you can find if you Google it or find my website, bsidneysmith.com, called "Socialism and the Green Party," because there was a lot of debate going on, has been for a long time, about what is the role of socialism within the Green Party? Is the Green Party socialist? How socialist is it? Blah blah blah. And so I wrote a longest essay on that, and a big central part of that is called "It's the Energy Stupid," playing off of James, James Carville's old uh, quip, during the Clinton years about "it's the economy stupid." Well, the
Right. Yeah.
economy is the energy, and if you don't understand the role of energy in the economy, then you don't understand the economy at all, because the economy is not a financial system; it's an energy system with a financial veneer laid over the top of it, right? but that financial veneer depends entirely upon what's going on in what we call the real economy, the movement of goods and services and materials, essentially the use of energy. So if you don't understand the role of energy in the economy, it's all very mysterious. A couple of outstanding resources for understanding that. I'll give you three names. Tim Watkins writes a blog called Consciousness of Sheep. He's writing from England. Outstanding resource on this material. Tim Morgan, also British, I think, writes the Surplus Energy Economics blog, which you can find by Googling that. And then, above all else, John Michael Greer, who lives here in the States, in New England, and has been writing on all of these issues for a couple of decades now, has my sincerest admiration. He's brilliant, and can really help unpack all these things.
And we can find all these names on your website?
I don't have those linked on my website, but if you look for those three things, Consciousness for Sheep by Tim Watkins, Surplus Energy Economics by Tim Morgan, and ecosophia.net is J.M. Greer's blog. He's an interesting guy. He's a Druid high priest, and so he alternates on his blog between writing about Druidism and magic and writing about the rest of the world. And I'm not a Druid, so I don't read many of the magic blogs, but his stuff about energy and the economy and history, he's really got a great handle on the present moment, all the stuff that's been going on this year, the war in Europe and all that. So highly recommended. Really,
that's very cool, because John Michael Greer, that name sounded familiar when you said it, and now I know exactly who you're talking about, because I'm not a Druid neither, but I've been heavily involved in, like, that side of spirituality since I was a youth, and still am to this day. It's not Druidism, but I get it. Okay, so that's very cool. So could you unravel a bit about the 2018 what's the peak energy thing? Because that's a little
okay, sure. So the
history
of energy.
War.
Yeah. So our civilization, industrial civilization, has its beginning in the late 18th century with the invention of the heat engine. Right. By heat engine, I mean engines, machines that turn heat into work. Right. So the steam engine is an obvious example. All those external combustion engines, like the old, steam trains where they were shoveling coal into the back of the train and all that, and internal combustion engines, and more recently, more exotic types of engines, turbine engines, and so on and so forth. They all are machines for turning heat into work, and that. We learned how to do that in the late 18th century. We built other machines to do work, but they didn't harness heat. They harnessed the wind or they harnessed water. Those are hundreds of years old. But machines that harness heat, that was new. And all of a sudden, people said, "Hey, you remember those really hard, flinty black rocks we found jutting out of the hill over there? Those things will burn forever. Let's try those out in the steam engine." That's coal, right? And that bubbly stuff that comes out of the ground, all those folks in Germany who were learning all about chemistry in the 18th and 19th century, they could figure out how to turn that into a really efficient fuel. So the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century, we had the age of coal and this huge expansion of industrialism, first in England, then across Europe and in the United States. And that coal civilization, coal-based civilization, industrial civilization, really peaked around the turn of the 20th century, so about 120 years ago. And when it did, Britain went from being the most powerful country in the world to a sudden collapse of empire. And by the 1930s, it was extremely weak. And the United States had discovered domestic sources of oil, huge amounts of oil, especially in Texas. At the same time, the chemistry had come to the point and the engineering had come to the point where that oil could be used to create much more powerful and more efficient engines than you could ever do with coal. And so the oil age took off, but now it was US centered rather than British or European centered. Coal didn't peak in the usual sense. It hit a peak, but it was conventionally mined coal, where you dig a hole and send a bunch of guys down it and they sort of tunnel around like rats, right? Later on, they decided to just take whole mountains apart. And so we got a lot more coal that way than they did back in the day. And coal was still a very important source of fuel, but it was really oil that drove the modern world. The modern industrial civilization runs on diesel. Whether it's tractors growing your food, or trucks or ships moving products around, or aircraft or anything else, it all goes on diesel. Gasoline is a byproduct of diesel. When you process to get diesel, you get gasoline as a byproduct, and that's why
Oh, I
we all
didn't know
have
that.
cheap gas to put in our cars. Right. So the United States controlled the oil market until 1970 because we were producing huge quantities of oil from these really easy to get to wells that produced all these gushers. And so we set the price. The Texas Oil Board, they just decided what oil was going to cost all the way around the world. And it was dirt cheap for Americans because we had it all. And that was great until 1970, when conventional oil in the United States peaked. That was the last year. That was the year when we produced the most conventional oil in the United States, and from there, it inevitably went downhill, because it's a finite resource. And anytime you use up a finite resource, you hit a point where you've produced as much as you can produce, as fast as you can produce, and after that, you're digging up the dregs from the bottom. So that was when the Middle East took over, the OPEC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, because they had the greater amount of oil. That's what caused the oil crisis of 1973, because suddenly the United States no longer controlled the price of oil. Somebody else did, and lo and behold, the prices went up. And that continued until 2005 with some variation. We learned how to build oil platforms out in the middle of the ocean. We found oil in Alaska. The British managed to find a whole bunch of oil in the North Sea, and that drove their heyday in the 90s and early 2000s. But in 2005, conventional oil peaked globally. That was the year in which the world produced the greatest amount of conventional oil. And after that, it started to go into decline. And that is really the underlying cause of the dynamic that unfolded in 2007 and 2008 with the great financial crisis. People who think that the economy is a financial system think it had to do with bad loans and banking. But those were a symptom. The underlying cause was a decline in the supply of energy. In fact, we really never recovered from 1970, because from 1945 to 1970, the amount of energy available to industrial civilization increased exponentially on a large curve. After 1970, it continued to increase, but no longer exponentially. It only increased on a linear pattern. And so our period of greatest expansion and greatest personal prosperity was in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And since then, as anybody my age can attest, average personal prosperity has been flat or declined. And it's because of the energy situation. In 2005, we had peak conventional oil, and that led to the crisis. And we then managed to mask over the top of that with non-conventional oil sources. We started getting tar sands from Canada. By 2014, we were pumping an enormous amount of oil out of fracked shale deposits in the United States. And very briefly, the United States once again became the world's greatest oil producer for about 4 years. But in 2018, that had run its course and is already in steep decline. The fracked wells are in huge decline. And in fact, it's worth pausing and talking about that just for a minute. It was never economically viable to get tight oil, oil shale and tar sands oil, because you have to put so much energy into getting the energy out, but the energy return on investment is too low. Consequently, you can't make money by investing in it. And what happened in the United States is that with the promise of, this endless amount of oil that was going to be fracked out of these shale wells, the investment community poured $250 billion into getting all this oil out of oil shale. And they never got that money back because it cost too much to get the oil. So you can't make money investing in it. And consequently, they're no longer investing in it, because why would they do that? Right. And so the wells that would be needed to produce more oil aren't getting drilled. And so in late 2018, we hit peak oil totally around the world, conventional oil and tight oil. And at the same time, it's become obvious that the OPEC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, have also peaked, because every time they promise to increase capacity, it doesn't happen. In fact, they haven't met their own quotas for a couple of years now. They're way below their quotas that they've set for themselves internally in OPEC. And it's because their wells have peaked. And so the amount of energy available to civilization is now permanently in decline. And I want to emphasize that the amount of energy available to us is permanently in decline. Now, people say, we should probably talk a lot about renewable energy, because I know
Yeah.
a lot of people think that's going to save us. And I'd love to do that, but let's just finish off the oil story. The world we have, the transportation and manufacturing and agricultural infrastructure of industrial civilization today runs on diesel. And the only way to keep it going is to figure out some way to either keep it running on diesel, and that can't happen because the amount of diesel is declining, or find a substitute that is as good as diesel for those purposes. And that doesn't exist. And so as a dissipative structure, we are now faced with what all dissipative structures face when the fuel runs out. The fire dies. And that's what's happening.
Wow. That sucks.
Well, yes and no. Again, remember, my video is how to enjoy the end of the world.
Right. I wanted to get to that eventually. Did you want to talk about renewables first? Because we're going to end it on a happy note. We're going to how to party, how to eat, live.
Who likes our industrial civilization? Who likes living in this civilization, right? Who likes living in the oil age? I mean, God, it's awful, isn't it?
It's pretty.
Isn't it just horrible?
There's some perks for sure, but I get you. Every day it's more
depressing, and it's destroying the world. The natural world. I mean, there's so many things to hate about it. Shouldn't you rejoice that it's finally coming to an end? Because it is, right? And so that's one thing. And the other thing is, suppose it didn't. I mean, suppose that somehow it turned out that there's some vast oil field that everybody's overlooked up to now and will keep us going for another 100 years. What would happen? Well, we'd kill the biosphere. Right. We don't want to keep burning that oil. We don't want to kill the biosphere because we're part of it. If it goes, we go.
Right.
Right. We can't live apart from it. So we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So it's not a bummer that we've hit peak oil. It is, in fact, finally, thank goodness, because otherwise
you can put this crap out of its misery. Yeah, another thing too about systems analysis and so on is the exponential increase of problems that happen. I'm trying to gather my thought here. You think of the glacier on Greenland, right? Okay, if a little bit on the edges melt off because the heat is warming up, the land is warming up. That heat transfers to the underpinnings, the underside of the rest of the glacier, which causes it to melt even faster, so on. So that water goes up into the air, it turns into clouds, it comes over to Iceland and dumps a bunch of crap on Iceland, which causes also, it just goes on. And, it just has to do with the interconnectedness of everything, which is a mystically, magically beautiful, wonderful thing. And I love it. But let's not forego understanding the difficulties and complexities of that as well, because it's just like a spider's web. You ting it over here, that shakes over here. You have to remember that that's how reality is, because a lot of what you're saying is you're describing real world systems. I mean, this is how systems go, all of them, all physical ones. So it's not that we are doing it. We're definitely making it happen more rapidly. There's no doubt about that. It could have been a lot different. It certainly could have been a lot different. It's
not clear that that's true.
Well, that's if you're a determinist or not.
Well, no, I don't think it's that. See, there's a tendency for people to think that we somehow control this thing, and there's zero evidence that that's the case, and every reason to believe that, in fact, nobody has ever had any control over it at all. If you pour fuel on a fire, it's going to burn the fuel. Right. And when all that energy from all the fossil sunlight became available to civilization, civilization isn't something that people plan. They don't design it. Right. They don't sit down and say, let's have a civilization with powered personal transportation and representative democracy and capitalist financial institutions. Let's do that. Nobody did that. There were a bunch of people who were as bewildered by the world as anybody is today, who said, it makes sense for us to do this right now because I can kind of see the benefit. And it's like an anthill. Anthills aren't designed by ants. They're built by ants, but they didn't design them. They just did their ant thing. And the anthill itself is an emergent property. It's a property of complexity because of all these thousands and thousands of ants just interacting with each other the way that ants do. Civilization is an emergent property of human society. We didn't design it. We didn't set about to do it. We don't control it. It just arose out of the billions of interactions between billions of people and between those people and their environment. And all of those people were simply acting in the normal way that human beings do. So, you can say, well, it could have been different. Well, maybe if human beings were different, maybe if the circumstances had been different, but there was nobody back there who made some decision that set the course of civilization. No person, no group of people. There were people who did things that we can trace the consequences of the things they did, but it's not because they were setting out to cause those things to happen. And there's no way for us to know, no way for anyone to know in any moment, in any complex system, what the consequences of your actions will precisely be as it unfolds into the future. That's the nature of complexity. So what we're faced with is what anybody is ever faced with, which is the present situation. We have no freedom in the past. We have no freedom in the future. All of our freedom is in the now. And we have to look at our present situation and say, how shall I now act according to my understanding of what is the good? But that's what most people have done most of the time in most places. So it's very problematic to say, oh, well, it might have been different, because at best, it's extremely speculative. And at worst, it describes an agency to humanity that humanity doesn't have.
There are massive epistemic limitations in each individual and even collectively concerning complex systems. I mean, you just can't. That's, again, like going back to civilization is a problem solver, and technology is definitely a symptom or an effect of civilization. We build computers to do things that the brain can't do as rapidly, as complexly, is that the word? As we can. I mean, the human mind is still, as far as neuronal synapses firing and so on and processing information, is extremely complex. But like the conscious understanding of things is a totally different ballgame.
Well, and none of it is to say that there haven't been greedy assholes doing horrible things. There have been,
this isn't a moral evaluation at all. No,
there are lots of greedy assholes right now who are doing terrible, terrible things. God, I'm spacing on his name, but he said, the earth is being destroyed, and it's being destroyed by people, and they have names and addresses. And there's a lot of truth behind that. The CEOs of the large companies are acting upon a set of values and coming from a place of privilege that we really ought to try to put an end to. Right. That's on us to try to do that. That's why we wear this shirt. But the idea that anybody could have controlled the outcome of civilization is it's a terrible road to go down, I think, because you end up just kind of trying to play this blame game. Whose fault is it?
Fair enough.
It's nobody's fault.
But I think of things like, let's just grant that DGR has a really good point in saying that agriculture is kind of where everything went wrong. Started to go wrong. Have you heard of permaculture?
I have.
Okay, so permaculture, I'm certified in horticulture, and I have a certification in permaculture as well. And permaculture is basically using the methods that nature uses to grow stuff for ourselves.
Right. That's what I try to do in my own garden, actually, to the extent that I'm able to.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's 100%, as far as, physics goes, sustainable. I just sort of like imagining, like at the start of our agricultural practices, like people like saying, well, let's just use hugelkultur piles and, and that kind of thing, and bioswales and so on and so forth, and how differently things would have turned out. But I understand what you're saying. We do all live within confined boundaries and specific limitations of the material world, that we can't go outside of them to do anything. We can think outside of it, for sure.
Here's a nice historical thread, which I think is very illustrative and very instructive. We all hate the modern commercial corporation, and for very good reason, for the most part. Yeah. The modern, the Exxons and the Metas and the GMs and the Raytheons. I mean, these are powerful institutions in their own right that have far too much power. We shouldn't grant them that power. They do an enormous amount of damage. Very few people think about where corporations came from, and you have to go all the way back to the Middle Ages in the 12th century in Europe. And I'm thinking this came to my mind because you were thinking about DGR and agriculture is the problem, which an argument can be made if you like being a hunter-gatherer. But the The situation in Europe was this. The plow had been around forever. They invented it in the Middle East, about 12,000 years ago. And it's really nice because you dig a thing in the dirt and put seeds in it and they come up and grow. You can control the weeds and stuff. It works a lot better than just throwing seeds on the ground.
Sure.
The problem in Europe is it's wet and muddy. And those old plows didn't work because they'd get stuck in the mud. And in order to cut through that mud, you needed a lot more power. And the only way to get that power was to hook a whole lot of oxen together. But if you're a farmer, you don't own 8 oxen, right? You're lucky if you've got one. Maybe you and your neighbor own one together. And so, there were some technological interventions. They invented the plowshare, right, that cut the sod in front of the plow, and they invented the mud board that turned things over. These were all great, but you still needed a big team of oxen to cut that soil. And farmers didn't own big teams of oxen. So what did they have to do? They had to get together, and they had to form agreements about how to pool all their oxen and take turns plowing one another's fields. And what that led to for the first time in human history, and again, remember our capacity for problem solving and our ability to create abstract institutions, what that led to was the nascent corporation, a legal entity to which all of these individuals belonged, but which existed in its own right for the sole purpose of making sure everyone's fields got plowed every year so you could grow enough food. And so this is the reason capitalism came out of Europe and not out of China or Egypt or Africa or someplace. It came out of Europe because they were the ones who had the need to form these collective cooperative enterprises to solve the problem of the fact that, Europe tends to be a muddy hellhole about half the year. And so it makes it hard to cut the soil and grow stuff in it. And by the 13th, 14th centuries, of course, institutions had been created to make sure that the cattle that needed to be bought and sold could be bought and sold by the entity. Right? This is the nascent corporation, and the banking system that grew up around it was to make all of that possible. And by the time we got to the colonial period, of course, then we had the great big companies, the East Indies and the West Indies companies and so on and so forth. That's what led to the whole idea of a corporation is making it possible for people who didn't have the resources on their own to do what needed to be done, to form a cooperative entity that could do it. And that little thread really helps to explain a great deal about the trajectory of our civilization. Again, those people didn't plan the modern corporation, but they created what was necessary for the modern corporation to exist. And you can see exactly how it developed over time. And at every step of the way, it was a solution to a problem that needed to be solved and helped people solve it and, grew food. So I think that kind of example is very illustrative.
Yes, no, for sure. That's very, very well said. We only got like 7 or 8 minutes left here, so okay. I want to hear about the party side. All right, let's have a good time and watch the world collapse.
Well, there are 2 things to say about this. Probably for this audience, maybe we do. I made one video that I made the very first one. It's a prologue, why you shouldn't let collapse get you down. And one of the things I talk about that is the 2 most common unhealthy ways to deal with collapse. One is false optimism, right? That technology is going to save us, and renewable energy is going to save us. Something is going to go. Socialism is going to save us. There's all these different things that are somehow going to save us. They're not going to save us. Civilization is collapsing. It's already started. It's well underway. It's going to continue. Nothing to do about that. The other thing is the people who get into make a fetish of collapse, right? Who get into the whole doomism thing. It's all over. It's all done. You may as well, we stop having children because they'll never survive, and so on and so forth. The fact is, the future is completely uncertain, just as it has always been. If you're a human being, it's completely uncertain. Right? You don't know what's going to happen. And the fact of the matter is most human beings at most times have lived under the threat of annihilation. That's normal for human beings to live that way. So don't think of this as something extraordinary in that sense. The other thing is collapse takes a long time, right? We may see some really serious disasters and catastrophes. And there's always the threat in the modern age of a nuclear war, especially at the present moment. But collapse will probably unfold in the way that it has generally unfolded for most large civilizations in the past, as a series of crises and a step down in complexity and energy usage. And then everybody adapts, and there's sort of a short period of recovery, and then there's another crisis and another step down, because what's going to happen, one way or another, it can't be stopped, it's just physics, is our civilization is going to slowly but surely decline and adapt and decline and adapt and decline and adapt until it is in balance with the amount of energy available to it.
Right.
And the amount of energy available to it in the future is going to be far, 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 far less than we have now. But it will take time. And so, as an individual, as someone who wants to look toward a human future that is a good human future, and I think we should always be doing that. I think that's core just to being a human being. We should be raising our families, and we should be growing our food, and we should be building our communities. I can't emphasize enough how critical that is, building our communities, especially locally.
Yeah.
And adapting to the world as it unfolds around us. And boy, you can really live a full life that way. So you should.
Well, there you go. All right. That's very, very wise. Very interesting. Yeah, no, I started radio shows, and the whole Green Party thing had a lot to do with locality and
Mm-hmm.
local everything. Doing growing community gardens, and so on and so forth. Seriously, that seems to be where it's at. Again, going back to like the decentralization of systems, so like that, like concern yourself with your own node in the system, and you can connect with other nodes as you grow, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I only got
people have been making sustainable communities for many thousands of years. And look at the common system in Europe before the corporations came along and everything got privatized. They had a common system that lasted for 1,000 years. It was very sustainable, and people lived good lives. We make fun of the Middle Ages; they were all dirty and unwashed and serfs, but that's not really true. If you really look at the Middle Ages, especially the High Middle Ages, it was almost idyllic for most people most of the time. They didn't have to work very long. There were lots of holidays. There was childhood disease, so it made it kind of a lottery whether you were going to grow up. But once you did, you lived a long, full life, and it was a good life. There's a lot of things in the modern world I hope we can take with us. Medicine is one of them. But we need to get used to the idea that we don't have to have our own private steel chariot. We don't necessarily have to be able to keep our homes artificially lit all the time. We don't have to do a whole lot of things in order to be in a really fine, good world, a good human world.
Yeah, that is for sure. I think a lot of concern though is just as things collapse, even slowly, you're going to find
there's no sugarcoating it. There's going to be horrific suffering.
Exactly. Because violence is going to be an outcome of socio-political, economic collapse.
Yeah,
Period.
there are going to be wars, and there are going to be famines.
Right.
And that's
as you're saying, what you were saying a minute ago, I was thinking about the energy shortage and stuff like that in Europe, and Putin's constant saber rattling concerning nuclear war. I'm wondering, does he know everything that Sid is saying? So he's like, okay, well, in order to buy some time, we're going to take back a couple parts of the Ukraine just for our own survival. And if we can't, screw it. We're just going to take everybody down.
Well, first of all, I don't want to get into the propaganda war, and that's what it is. And if there were anybody whose ear I would love to bend, it wouldn't be Putin's, it would be Biden's, assuming he's capable of hearing it. Yeah, let's not talk about Ukraine. I'll just say that it's a tragic situation. I hate the war. It's horrifically dangerous for all of us, and most of what we've been told about it's a lie. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay, fair enough. All right, on that note, we got another 30 seconds left. Anything you'd like to end it with? You want to plug your website or anything?
Well, I love to hear from people on the YouTube videos. So if anyone wants to leave a comment, if anyone has any questions, obviously we've only scratched the surface of most of these things. I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear more about the role of the Green New Deal, so-called, and why it won't stop what's coming, and can't, and why in many ways it's made things worse. We need to rethink some of that. There are a whole lot of things I'm sure that people would like to talk about. So we can do that. If not in this forum, then in some other.
Absolutely. Well, and actually, on that note, I would love to have you back because, as you said, we are just scratched the surface here, and I got 8 million more things to talk about with you. So, there's all sorts of things that you brought up. I'm like, okay, well, what about this? What about this? So we need to definitely have you back. That would be great. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rich, with the fascinating discussion with B. Sidney Smith. Thank you so much, sir. Tip of the hat to
Thank
you and
you.
all you do. This is fantastic stuff. Till next time, everybody, be good, be green. And there's this